So it should be recording now. So sorry for this interruption, Fernando. So going back to just introducing our guest today, Professor Lara works on theorizing spaces of the Americas with emphasis on the dissemination of architecture and planning ideas, but beyond the traditional disciplinary boundaries. And in his several articles, Professor Lara has discussed the modern and the contemporary architecture of our continent, its meaning, context, and social economic insertion. But I think that more importantly for us today, Professor Lara has been a very active voice for scholarship on coloniality in architectural and spatial history of the Americas. And the two recent volumes that have just come out within the last year, one on spatial concepts for decolonizing the Americas, and then the other, Decolonizing the Spatial History of the Americas, part of which we read for today. They're the most recent results of Fernando's tireless research efforts, helping to fill what I consider to be a longstanding gap in the architectural and epistemological history of the Latin territories, and thus making a fundamental and I think a much needed contribution to the studies of post-colonialism and coloniality in architecture. And I could not think of a better guest to talk to us on this topic today. But other recent publications, they also include Excepcionalidad del Modernismo Brasileño, that is modern architecture in Latin America, that was a runner-up for the Hamilton Awards, and also Quid Novi, that did get the Best Book Award by Unpark. And Professor Lara is the editor of the series Latin America Thoughts, and also a member of several editorial boards across several Latin American countries, including Aula, Architecture and Urbanism in Las Americas, the Revista de Arc, or the magazine or journal de Arc at Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia, the Revista POS at the FAUSP, that's the architectural school in Sao Paulo, and Architectures del Sur, Universidad Bio Bio in Chile, and also the Revista Urbana at Unicamp. And at the University of Texas at Austin, Professor Lara teaches seminars on 20th century Latin American architecture and urbanism, theory of architecture, and doctoral courses on decolonial methods for architectural history. And without further ado, I will pass the mic, so to speak, the podium, this virtual podium, and the screen, let's say then, to Professor Fernando Lara. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Marta. It's a great honor to be the guest speaker to this class this year. I want to remind the students that there's something that I really, really like, that Marta and I we know many people in common. We should have met before, but we met when we both walked out of an auditorium of a conference because somebody defended colonialism, and then we both in protest. We and another 3 or 4 people walked out of the auditorium. That's how I met Marta. So I'm really happy to continue this conversation after that initial encounter of that small protest that we did. Well, pleasure to be here. You've read the text, I think my 5 radical proposals for architecture education. And the lecture is about them, but I will just tell a little bit more of the stories. I'll tell a little bit more about myself, things that are not on the text, and things that illuminate how I got here, what brought me here to this point, to this moment, to those thoughts. So I'll start with the installation, and something that, oops, it's not changing. Okay, the installation now, those 235 ceramic tiles are in this blue wall. It's an apartment owned by a school of architecture in São Paulo called Escola da Cidade. They use the apartment to host their visiting professors, so people who are invited to speak História da Cidade will sleep here in this apartment and probably have dinner or eat something in this living room looking at this wall. And the wall is in this building. The apartment is in this building. This is the Copan building by Oscar Niemeyer, designed in 1956, 57, I believe. It's a very important building in the history of modern architecture in Brazil and downtown São Paulo. And this is the building in its context. So if you can see the cursor, the apartment is around here on the 19th floor. Probably this one that has all renovated, clean, breeze solar. And this is the view of downtown São Paulo that you see opposite to that wall. I had no idea that installation would be so important to me. But the more I think about it and the more I talk about it, the more it becomes important. The story of the installation is, this is the first iteration, the same tiles, but mounted on a different wall during the São Paulo Biennale of 2017. The story of the installation starts in 2016. As you remember, in 2016, we had an election in the US and won by a candidate that was demonizing everything that I stand for. I am a Latin American immigrant, and I write about Latin American architecture. And that semester was pretty tough. My studio actually was dealing with the border between US and Mexico. And after the election, my family decided that we need to take a break from all of that. So my wife had an invitation. I took a leave of absence. I took a leave of absence without pay. And I went to Brazil, where I grew up, for the first half of 2017. And I was invited to teach at the University of São Paulo. They have Institute for Brazilian Studies there. And I taught a course there that I had developed in Texas, which is theorizing spaces for the Americas. I was looking at and kind of resisting how Eurocentric our discipline is, and trying to highlight or discuss concepts that I think are important to the Americas. This has been going on in my scholarship for a while. Those events of 2016 and 2017 taught me to disregard the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo as a border. I don't recognize that as a line that separates North America from Latin America or Anglo-America from Hispanic America, etc. It's a colonial border. It's an inheritance of colonialism. And also because living close to that border in Austin, Texas, I understand that the borders are a region. So the transformation starts when you go south of Dallas, if you're driving on I-35, and then you cross Austin, and when you get to San Antonio, it's already a completely different US. And when you cross into Mexico, it's also a completely different Mexico. And you get to Monterrey, a very large city, very beautiful, interesting city, the largest, more industrial city of the north of Mexico. It just looks like San Antonio, and you feel like you are in San Antonio. So I do not recognize those lines as borders, and I developed my own scholarship in that way. I don't want to be a Latin Americanist anymore. I want to talk about the Americas. And so the installation was the first physical iteration of looking at the Americas. There's no borders on the installation. There's no separation between countries. It's this continent, and it's about how much this continent shares. We share a history of Amerindian Holocaust, the elimination of our native inhabitants. Then we share the history of slavery, and then we share a history of exclusion and settler colonialism. Those things are shared from Canada to Chile. And we need to talk about those similarities because we have talked way too much about the differences. So I don't want to highlight the differences. I want to highlight the similarity. But the story of this installation, I've never done an installation before. I taught studios because I love studio. I have an architectural, a professional degree, but I was mostly teaching theory and some history. But I was in São Paulo, and the curator of the Biennale invited me one day to have a talk. And he had heard about my course on theorizing spaces of the Americas. He was interested in those topics, and he said, I want you to do something for the Biennale. And I thought, fine. I mean, in my mind, he said, I have a wall for you. I will give you a wall. And in my mind, I thought about writing something. That's what I do. I mostly write. And I started asking him about the space and the writing and the lettering and the format and the template. And he said, no, I don't want any text. I don't want any text at all. I want an installation. And I don't know how I said yes, but I left that meeting. That was in April or May of 2017. I left the meeting and I thought, what the hell did I just agree to? I've never done an installation before. But then summer went by. I went back to Austin to teach in the fall. And then I proposed to my students that we should do the installation together. That was going to be part of my studio. In 2016, there was also a major disaster in Minas Gerais, in the region where I grew up. A mining dam burst, and toxic mud from iron mining came down the hill and obliterated the village and killed 19 people. So my studio was to design a memorial for those people. And engaging with the mud and that history, I thought we should do something with mud, with ceramics. So the proposal to the students was, let's look at all the architecture of the Americas, all of them, from the Guggenheim in New York City to Louis Kahn's Salk Institute in San Diego, the Eames House in LA, the Museo de Antropología in Mexico City, the Pampulha building by Oscar Niemeyer in my hometown. Let's look at this fancy architecture, but let's also look at apartments. Let's look at shotgun houses, indigenous construction, indigenous buildings. Let's look at the favelas. Let's look at everything. The postmodern of the 1970s and 80s, everything. The students took the challenge, and each of them had to draw 12 little architectures, 12 little facades, from the fancy buildings all the way down to the trailer homes and favelas. And then we worked on those drawings, we abstracted them, we put them as to work on the laser cutters, and they created those molds, those little molds, 4 by 6 inches. And we took the molds to Brazil with us, and we worked on a ceramic very close to the disaster site. And we had a workshop for 2 days with the people who know ceramics well, pressing our molds into clay and then generating 300 little pieces of ceramics that represent all the architectures of the Americas. Those were then, after we came back, they were fired and they were shipped to São Paulo to be at the wall of the Biennale. That experience, the whole experience from 2016 to this, which is the fall of 2017, October of 2017, that whole year, I think was very important to me and to my reflections. And the fact that after the Biennale, the História da Cidade gave us this wall for the installation to be for the next many years, gave me just a lot of food for thought and a lot of ideas about why was that so important? Why was that so central to my scholarship? And I came back with those 5 points that I want to talk to you about. First, the installation was a collaboration. I was the lead author, I was leading the process, but I can't say that I did the installation. There were so many people involved, from the students who did the drawings to the ceramic people that help us to press them on clay and then fire them, to the people who installed the buildings on the wall. That was not me, so it was a collaboration. It also talks about a multiplicity of influences, with kind of an expansion of the field that is important. It raises new concepts for thinking about the Americas. That's something that is very central to my scholarship. We have something unique on our design disciplines. We truly believe that space matters, that we are formed by our spaces. But when it comes to the concepts and ideas that we use to analyze those spaces, they are mostly coming from Europe. So what are the concepts that come from the Americas? What are the ideas that come from our continent? Expanding the scholarship boundaries is a consensus. It's also, expanding is easy. I like to say to my fellow historians that everybody agrees that the way we teach architectural history needs to expand, and we need to include more. But we still have a 3 or 4 hour seminar on 14 weeks. So in order to include more, we need to cut some. And then the conversation becomes really difficult when we start talking about what do we cut. And first of all, the double standards of knowledge and culture, which is what brought me to that reflection. So I will follow on my slides here. So first issue that I wanted to talk about, the first proposal to engage the colonization of architectural knowledge, is the issue of knowledge and culture. I drew this map in 2005, so it's almost 20 years ago now, 18 years ago, 17, sorry, I'm lost on my math here. And this map has been with me for a while, and I think it's a powerful way to convey that. I mean, I took the 4 famous books that we teach modern architecture with, William Curtis, Vincent Stully, Kenneth Frampton, and Jean-Louis Cohen, and I look at all the buildings that they mention, and I put a little dot on the map for every building that they mention, and the result is so explicit. The result, I call this result pornographic, because it's more than explicit. The concentration on the North Atlantic, it's not a coincidence that the military treaty that runs the planet since World War II is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. So I introduced the idea of modern architecture being not Eurocentric, but NATO-centric. It's Western Europe plus the East Coast of the US, or New England. And the map shows the big voids, the gigantic voids that we have in the global South. The map also represents something else. It represents an intellectual, conceptual divide that we need to overcome. If you ask most people in the planet, where do they think knowledge is concentrated, they would point to the regions that are highlighted in the map. People say that the US have a lot of knowledge, Europe has a lot of, Japan has a lot of knowledge. Then if you ask people which cultures they think are more interesting or more intense, then they would point to my native Brazil, or Nigeria, or Ethiopia, or India, or the Philippines. So there is this major divide between we acknowledge knowledge, we assign knowledge to the wealthy military powers of the North, and we assign culture to everybody else. We must revert that dichotomy. That's the first thing that we should do in order to try to decolonize architectural knowledge. There is knowledge everywhere. There's knowledge with the Yanomami, in the Amazon forest. There's knowledge in the south of Africa. There's knowledge, a lot of knowledge in India. There's knowledge in Vietnam. There's knowledge everywhere. We also need to provincialize the North and talk about its culture that we sometimes don't. We think of the global North as a place that is rational and full of knowledge and making rational decisions. And I'll give you an example. I live in a state where the majority of people think that if they have more guns, they will be safer. There is not a single data point that rationally explains that. It's not, there's not a single data point anywhere in the history of humanity that tells us that more weapons make us safer. It's the culture. And we need to acknowledge that culture and engage with that culture. So reverting the dichotomy of knowledge and culture, culture and knowledge, is the first major step for decolonizing architecture. And then we will understand the role of the Americas in that whole construction. And that's a part of the my scholarship that is a little bit more recent. I did not develop it so much on that chapter, but I am devoted to distilling that. And the new book and the one that I'm writing right now are very much about that. And the point about understanding the role of the Americas in the construction of architectural knowledge and architectural culture is because the European occupation of the Americas in the 16th century and the systematization of architectural knowledge in the 16th century are not separate events. They are very much interrelated. We developed the tools of spatial representation and spatial control and spatial abstraction in order to control the territories of the Americas. And the territories of the Americas had a huge feedback loop back into Europe in the development of all this knowledge. So I arrive at that kind of conversation by reading Henrique Dussel, Arturo Escobar, Aníbal Quijano, Walter Mignolo. Quijano is the pioneer of that thought back in 1992, so 30 years ago, talking about capitalism. He coined a phrase that is very synthetic and powerful. He said, it's not that the Americas participated in the rise of modern capitalism in Europe. There would be no modern capitalism if not for the occupation of the Americas. I take that phrase and I apply that to architecture. And it's still very heretic. Some people resist that a lot. Many people say that I have no proof of that, but I'm very happy asking the question. And the question that I propose for us to think is, it's not that the Americas participated in the development of modern tools and techniques of architecture. There would be no architecture as we know it, if not for the occupation of the Americas. So I'm taking that from Quijano. The other thing that I take from those scholars of the decolonial theory is that I spent 20 years of my life adjectivizing modern architecture in order to talk about Latin America. I had to talk about an incomplete modernization or a conservative modernization or an excludent modernization. When Arturo Escobar illuminates or elucidates the fact that there is no modernization without colonization, they are one and the same. So Escobar takes from Quijano and makes that development in this book, Encountering Development. The processes of modernization and the process of colonization are one and the same. And they are like two sides of the same coin. Of course, we love modernization. And don't take me wrong, I'm happy to enjoy the benefits of modernization. This afternoon, I will take the 4th shot of a vaccine that was developed in record time It's amazing that we developed the COVID vaccine in 1 year. And I'm now ready to take the 4th shot and try to survive okay the rest of the year. It's also amazing that we have better life expectancy, that we have all this knowledge, that I can be here in Chicago talking to you in New Haven or anywhere you are for those instruments. This is all very fundamental, but it's an insufficient explanation. We need to talk about the insufficiencies, and we need to talk about the colonized side of it. Because for all that to happen, you know, somebody is working in the mine somewhere in Bolivia to mine the minerals that we use on our computers. Somebody is working on a dumpster in Nigeria to recycle the I don't know, another toxic mineral. Somebody is breaking their bats to make sure that we have cheap tomatoes and cheap cucumbers, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to acknowledge that, and architecture has a major role into that construction. For instance, look at how history of architecture has been taught. I mean, this is the Bannister Fletcher first edition, 1896, and in the there should be other images here, but I think I moved them. So hold on to Bannister Fletcher for a while. What I'm trying to write about is the way that the Americas have been erased from that history. And I think later on, I will show the tree of architecture and how I apply the knowledge structure dichotomy to the tree of architecture. I'm sorry, I left one slide out of place here. The second proposal that I have for you today to discuss is that we need to expand the scholarship boundaries. I have worked a lot on that because I started my career talking about buildings not designed by architects. My PhD dissertation, my first book, was about buildings that look modern, but were not designed by architects. And on trying to understand that process, I ended up interviewing construction workers. And here in the US, and also in Brazil or in Mexico, or in most parts of Africa, the people who build the buildings designed by architects are the same people who build the shanty towns and the favelas. They are the same workers. They're the same construction workers. And they are a vector of knowledge. So going after the dissemination of knowledge, I started looking at the favelas, and I did several studios documenting them. And I see the domino. I see Le Corbusier 1915 proposal of concrete columns and concrete slabs to provide flexibility and affordability for the houses. It's exactly what we see here. All the buildings in the favelas follow somehow the logic of the domino. And when I wrote about that, and when I started discussing that, I got a lot of pushback because I was, I don't know, one famous scholar said that I was denigrating the work of Le Corbusier by applying it to the favelas. To me, it's a big compliment that Corbusier really wanted the domino to be a scheme, a type that would be used everywhere, by everywhere. He designed it to be simple and to be disseminated, and it was. And we can discuss if you have independent structures, if the walls follow the beams or not, or if they are really taking full advantage of the modern method of construction. That there's a lot to be discussed there. But there is a dissemination. There is a spatial idea that is coming from the great architects to the people. And I think we need to celebrate that. That brought me to later on to write the expansion of knowledge. So the expansion of knowledge that I'm talking about here is what I call the vertical expansion of architectural knowledge. So it's including the vernacular, including the most simple buildings. That's why I insisted in that installation that we draw also the most humble buildings not designed by architects, because I wanted to discuss that vertical relationship between the most celebrated buildings, like, let's say, the Guggenheim Museum by Frank Lloyd Wright or by Frank Gehry, both, and the way that that technology and that spatiality is being appropriated by the most humble of our fellow citizens. I also wanted to expand horizontally our knowledge, and that means going back to that map of 2005 and working on the voids of that map. So Luis Carranza and I wrote this book. We started in 2010. The book was published at the very end of 2014 with the date of 2015. And the book just follows the entire 20th century, the entire Latin America. And we cover thousands of buildings. And those are my earlier books on Brazilian modern architecture and the popular appropriation of it. The one on the left is the one that I wrote from my dissertation. And the one on the right is more recent. It's from 2019. And it's like the continuation of all my reflections and all my thoughts on why modernism became so popular in Brazil and escape the disciplinary boundaries, escape the control of the architects, institutes, and disciplinary control, and was actually adopted and adapted by the population at large. That expansion brought me, of course, to talk about this paper that is about the more conceptual, more theoretical idea of why the occupation of the Americas impacted the rise of architecture. And I wanted to talk about something here, because I'm more and more convinced that one of the things that we need to do in order to decolonize architecture is to bring new knowledges into it. And I'm talking about relational knowledges. I'm talking about the love that you have for the house you grew up, or the park where you used to hang out as a teenager, those kinds of things. This is a map of Mexico, drawn by somebody that drew that map in order to give it to Hernán Cortés to take it back to Spain in 1522, 1523, very early on at the beginning of the Spanish occupation of Mexico. And this is the development of representation that was happening at the same time. And I want to call your attention here to the difference between an itinerary and a map. Those of us who are old enough to have navigated our cities before the iPhones, we had itineraries. We had mental maps that says, or somebody would call you and tell you, like, to get to my house, you take this bus, you get down here, you follow this avenue until the gas station, you turn left, and then you walk another 2 blocks, and my house is the third after the church. What happens in that itinerary is that you are in what is represented. You are in there. When maps were developed in the 16th century to represent space of the Americas and the Atlantic Ocean to facilitate navigation, and then were systematized by René Descartes in the early 17th century. What happened there is the Cartesian separation between mind and everything else. He wrote about mind and body, but in reality it's between the mind of European man and the body that includes everything else, their own body plus everybody that is not European, not male. So, and the representation the spatial abstraction is a process of separating you from what is being represented. So before the 16th century, there were lots of navigations. The North Africans, the Europeans navigated the Mediterranean. The people of the Philippines navigated all their islands. The Polynesians navigated. The Chinese had gigantic ships that they went to Africa to do trade. But everybody used itineraries. Colombo himself used itineraries in his voyages. It was only in the 16th century that the map making technique was developed and then separates you from what is being represented. Now think about that in architectural terms. It's exactly the same. The 16th century treatise of Scamozzi and later Palladio are the ones who articulated this separation. And then we tend to give credit to Alberti for being the first who separated architecture from construction. Alberti started to talk about it, but it was a 16th century treatise that systematized it, and the treatises were financed, sponsored, and published to facilitate control of the territories, to facilitate control of whatever territories the Spanish were trying to control in Italy, or the French were trying to control across the Rhine River in what is nowadays Germany, or the Portuguese was trying to control in Africa or in Brazil. It's the military and economic investment in those techniques of representation created the modern maps and created the modern systems of architectural knowledge. And they are based on that separation. They are based on separating you from what you are controlling. So think about that in our pedagogy. What do we still do with every first-year student in architecture? We tell them, forget your previous life, forget the spatial experience that you had in your house, your neighborhood, your building, your apartment. We don't teach you from scratch. We don't tell you what a wall is, what a roof is, what a good space is, what a bad space is. We impose on our students that break that was systematized by René Descartes. And this is Albert Dürer and then René Descartes in the early 17th century. And we need to work on the insufficiency of that. It's not that we're not going to abandon the spatial representation. No, we need them. We need them to bypass the climate crisis. We need them to design better. We needed them to bypass also the social crisis of exclusion and inequality. But we need other knowledges to infiltrate that process, and they are relational knowledges. We need to understand your love. We need to understand your relationship with the spaces, and we need to bring those knowledges into the design conversation. And this includes participatory processes and being open to things that cannot be drawn. That will allow us to have new concepts for thinking about the Americas. That's what we did on our, let me see how I'm going in time here. That's what we did in the seminar, in the colloquium in 2020, that gave us two books, the two books that Marta mentioned when she presented me. And the idea is that we need to look at this man. Now, this is the Brazilian Congress being built in 1958. And we ignore the fact that you have those men there, you can see with no protective gear whatsoever, climbing the rebar in order to bring the concrete to the beautiful shell of Oscar Niemeyer. Shifting those gears and expanding the knowledge forces us to look at all those colonialities, like the fact that these men were treated as dispendable, right? Like disposable. There's many of them, so you don't need protective gears. You don't need to worry about their safety. There's many more if one of them fall. We also need to think that all this rebar came from a mine somewhere in the earth, and all this concrete came from another mine of lime, and etc. etc. It's things that I've been talking about and writing about. Allowed me to edit those two books that I am very happy that they are out in the world now and are being discussed. Allows me to think about multiplicity of influences. That's about how the way we teach. That's about the way we understand. And here is the tree of architecture that I moved to this part. This is an illustration from the Bannister Fletcher book from the early 20th century. And it shows very well the construction that we did on the NATO-centric construction of how we teach architecture. We assign Peruvian ancient architecture, Egyptian ancient architecture, Chinese and Japanese and India and Mexican ancient architecture. We assign them to not history, as if they were non-historical, they had no history. And then history is the construction of the Western Europeans, that history starts with Greece, goes through the Roman Empire, through the Middle Ages to Renaissance, Baroque, etc., etc. Again, I don't have time to talk about Viollet-le-Duc, but we need to flip that history, non-history, and understand them as the same as the knowledge and culture dichotomy. On the left here, you have the history the way it was taught to me. And hopefully we are advancing towards not teaching the same history to you. But I learned history, I grew up in Brazil, and I learned that my history was the history of Asia as an European prehistory. Then you have the Greek world, the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, and modernity that starts with the Renaissance. The reality is on the right is much more complex. This is a diagram by Walter Mignolo. The reality is much more complex. So when you look at the tree of the Bannister Fletcher, we are looking at this diagram on the left here that is oversimplified and reductionist. What we need is a tree, or I don't know, vines, or some other metaphor more complex that will encompass a much more complex and all those loops and feedbacks of a much more complex history. So that's something that I think we are doing. I think we are working on that. I see a group of scholars working on that and trying to bring new complexities and new layers to that history. And the final thing to wrap up is we need to break our emphasis on authorship, especially single authorship. We need to understand that architecture is done collectively. I think we do a disservice to our students when we insist that they're going to be the new Hempulhas or the new Zaha Hadid or the new Frank Gehry. None of those work alone. Actually, Koolhaas is a little better on acknowledging that, on the way that he organized, a little better, organizes his office. But architecture is a collaborative profession, and we need to engage collaboration. Now, collaboration is also crucial because we can provide a vision. So right now, until now, I just kind of trashed architecture and pointed to all the complex things and bad things that we do and problematic things that we do. There's also a beautiful side of it. And the beautiful side of it is that we have the power to provide a vision. If we want a city without cars, we have to design the city without cars. We have to draw the city without cars. If we want a city without exclusion, if we want a city that is inclusive and has basic service for everybody, we need to draw that city. If we want an architecture that have minimal impact on natural resources, we need to draw that architecture. We have the power to articulate that vision. And I will wrap up with one story. I think I still have some 5 minutes before we go into the questions. I was an intern 30 years ago, a little bit more than 30 years ago, probably 1990 or 91. And I was working for an office, and they were building this building that you see here on the right. This is in a small town, about an hour and a half away from the city where I lived. And my job as an intern was to drive there once a week and check the drawings versus what was being built. And in the drawings, those triangles here were pointing up. They were not pointing down like they are here. They were pointing up in the drawing of the facade. So I got there one day, and they had built the drawing, the triangle windows upside down. And then I panicked. And 1990 or 91, there were no cell phones, nothing. So I panicked. I tried to talk to the masons. They said, no, now it's done. It's a lot of money to redo them, etc., etc. So I just drove back to the office a little too fast than I should. And I got to the office, and I was talking to the lead architect and said, they messed up, and they did the windows upside down, and it's completely wrong, etc. And the architect told me, it's okay. I mean, how come it's okay? It's completely different. It's not what we designed. It's not what, no, it's okay. Those things happen. They don't have a budget to correct that. They are already very tight budget. Let it be. And I was very nervous and very, I thought it was a little bit of my fault that they did that. I mean, I was the one responsible to go there every week and check the drawings. And then he went to the other room and brought back a little painting that was on his wall and had a mandala. It was in Portuguese, so I translated it to English here for you. And it is this mandala. All design is probabilistic because all humans are architects. You can read it that way, or you can read all humans are architects because all design is probabilistic. What he was trying to teach me is that what we put on the design, on the computer files or the paper, there's just a probability that it will be done exactly as you design. Because there's a lot more people that will be engaged on that, from the client who's paying for everything, to the structural engineers, to the systems, to the contractors, to the people who will deliver the materials, to the ones who will assemble it on site, and to the very last construction worker who will stain the floors and polish the floors. Everybody alters their environment. So decolonizing architecture means getting rid of the idea that one genius controls the built environment, and accept the fact that you're like a maestro of the orchestra at best. Your best possibility, if you are a very successful architect, you are like the maestro. You're trying to make sure that everybody is tuned and everybody is following the tempo. But that's all you can do, because everybody's playing their own instrument. And the best you can do is just make sure that the tempo is correct and that the orchestra is tuned. So I will finish here. Those are my ideas about the challenges of decolonizing architecture, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Fernando. Thank you for a fantastic and inspiring presentation, and especially for bridging, the critical thinking and digging into the history of architecture and architectural historiography and the wrongs that have been done, but then bridging also and projecting into the future, and giving us, these these possibilities, because it is hard to do. It is very hard to do.
Yeah.
And I really, really appreciate it.
And you know, academic life puts you in some niches, right? And it puts you into some little boxes. But I like to remind myself that my main job is to educate the next generation. It's the main job is the teaching. And we are rewarded for writing books and going to prestigious conferences and writing in the prestigious journals. But at the end of the day, the main job is to teach. So I try to follow that. I try to remind myself that, because it's easy to forget.
Yes, and we really appreciate that sort of these many doors that are both critical, but also then with visions with possibilities for the future. And I know that many of the students are interested in probing further into these possibilities. So what we'll do now is that we'll go over, take turns asking the students from each section and see how many questions we can then get answered here. So I'll ask first, Jane, if you can then call someone from section B. We'll start with section B and a question from section B. And I'll ask the students that when we call on you to pose your questions, to unmute, but also then if you can, to copy your question on the chat, because that could be helpful to read as well. All right. Well, Jane, let's start with section B then.
Great. Thank you, Fernando, very much for the super stimulating lecture. I will ask Silas to unmute and post his question directly to you.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. It was really informative. So here's my question. One second. I'll copy it into the chat. Okay, well, I'll read it first. In the conclusion of abstraction is a privilege, you note how the studio of pedagogy teaches the students to master abstraction, almost always discarding the site or context or content in order to manipulate only geometry. And then I was thinking, to the credit of our studio teachers right now, I believe site has played a major role in our learning, but I think the point of the architectural values as abstraction can remove the students and architecture from what's real. And in our discussion as a group so far, digital modeling has become a recurring topic. In order to make forms in the Rhino software, we must type in words such as loft, extrude, drape, and apply surface. And I think that these commands and digital modeling in general can add an ingenuine level of abstraction to our work. And Jane made a really good point that in some sense, digital reasoning and digital modeling is not that different from cartographical reasoning. And so my question is, rather than abandoning abstraction altogether, how should we reconcile the tension between abstraction, digitalization, and equality? And maybe you answered it during your talk about collaboration and through drawing. But I'd like to...
That's a very good question, Silas. Thank you. You're absolutely correct that the way that our softwares are designed, they kind of double down on the abstraction, because they mostly only include geometry as a parameter. I think there's some interesting things coming up from the arts, the way that they are doing digital art and including other variables into the algorithms. Like I would love to see, Rhino have a button for love, or for sadness, or for or for frustration, or can we include new concepts into that conversation? Can we parametricize those things, or maybe the digital is not the place to do it. Maybe you need to get your digital ideas and put them in clay and makes your hand dirty and just have that tactile. I like to think that there's a lot to learn in the design process when you shift media, when you shift from digital to paper, from paper to model, from model to another digital. There's a lot to learn on those shifts. But I also think that we need to infiltrate that with other knowledges that are not geometrical, and they're really hard to measure. So how do you measure frustration? How do you measure love? How do you measure attraction? But I think we need to work on that direction. I do think we need to incorporate other variables that are beyond what can be measured by geometry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Silas. And now we'll move on for a question from section C. Iris, if you can call from section C.
Yes, Fernando, thank you very much for the lecture. I do hope we get more time in the end to ask more questions ourselves. I'll ask Kevin from section C if he can unmute himself and pose his question and also post it in the chat.
Hello, thank you again for the talk. So my question was that in your piece, Abstraction is a Privilege, I found it really interesting how your argument against abstraction resonated with a lot of the readings on phenomenology that we covered in past weeks, both the colonial abstraction of form and in the context that you challenged, and also the rationalist abstraction of phenomena that phenomenology challenges, move the conditions and the histories of object and place. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the relationship between your work and that of phenomenology, and is there a sort of phenomenology of colonialism that has a place in contemporary discourse?
That's a very good question. Thank you. I come to that from the very opposite perspective. Before doing my PhD in architectural theory, I did a master's in semiotic. That was the early 90s, and I was studying post-structuralism. So I studied Roland Barthes and Derrida and Deleuze and Foucault, and I was trying to work on the language. That work was very much based on language, and we have the debate, right? The ongoing debate between language and experience. Structuralism and post-structuralism tell us that everything is mediated by language, so the experience is mediated by language, and phenomenology tells us the opposite, that experience comes first. I actually think it's the chicken and the egg issue. It doesn't matter which one comes first. We need them both. And you are absolutely correct to point to phenomenology as a probably antidote to abstraction. I do think that traditional phenomenology is a little bit limited. Like when I read Bachelard, and he talks about the attic, for instance, the space of the attic in the house. I never had an attic. I grew up in an apartment in a big city. So that doesn't apply to me. But I'm sure there is a phenomenology of the apartment building. There's a phenomenology of the stairway of the apartment building, and the hallway downstairs, and the encounters in the stairway and the elevator. There is a need for that phenomenology to be developed. So when I'm arguing for relational knowledge, it's very similar to the idea of phenomenology. It's an area that I'm not very comfortable in phenomenology. It's a little bit far from what I have worked so far. But I see the value there. I see the importance there. Like Juhani Palasma, for instance, talking about how optic-centric architecture is, all about the eye, and that we need to include the other senses. That makes total sense to me. That makes total sense to me. I just haven't had a chance to study phenomenology with the depth that I would like to. So I have to say I fear it a little bit. I am not. It's a little bit foreign to me, but maybe I should go there in the future. Thank you for the nudge.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And I agree. I completely relate to Fernando, your mention of the attic in Bachelor, and exactly my same reaction in thinking, can there be a phenomenology of the terrace rather than the attic? Yeah. But you mentioned relational knowledge. And so now from section A, I'll pass it to Eric, because I think that will also connect to his question too. Eric, if you can unmute and copy your question, please.
Hi, thank you, Professor Lara, for your very interesting talk. So my question, so you were talking about in the abstraction is a privilege. You talk about how we abandon the relational knowledge instead of trade it for the superficial understanding of space, which I think is the abstraction you were talking about. So what could you elaborate on, like, what are these relational knowledge that we have abandoned? This is the first question. So the second question is, can this framework of architecture decolonization in Americas be applied to other parts of the world?
Thank you. Thank you. Let's start with the second question. Sure. Definitely the decolonization of the American spaces should have parallels in the decolonization of other spaces. I was in Singapore 10 years ago, and scholars in Singapore called a conference and they brought people from all over the planet to Singapore. And their central idea was that the way that architectural history is taught in the North Atlantic, it doesn't work for Asia. It really doesn't work. So they are deliberately trying to develop alternative architectural histories that would work for Singapore, for China, for Vietnam, for the Philippines. And I think they are ahead of us. I mean, they are doing that in 2012, and we are doing that in 2018, 2020. So definitely that's the case. Now, about relational knowledge, there is a theory from an anthropologist called Eduardo Viveiros de Castro that it's supposed to explain all the ancient civilizations of the Americas and their relationship to nature. So he developed it in the Amazon with the Yanomami in the north of the Amazon and the Xingu in the south of the Amazon. And it was like 20 years ago. And right now I know there are people testing that theory with communities in Alaska, in the Southwest, the Maya in south of Mexico, the Inca in Peru, etc. And the theory is called Amerindian perspectivism. And I'll try to explain it in a few minutes. Basically, Amerindian perspectivism says that for the ancient inhabitant of the Americas, the indigenous people of the Americas, everybody has potential humanity. Everything has potential humanity. There is no separation between human and nature. So for them, if you get a pebble on the creek and you clean that pebble and you polish the pebble and you drill a hole in the pebble and you hang the pebble on your neck, the pebble becomes more human and you became more pebble once you do that. And those of us who work with wood know exactly what this is about. You work a lot with wood and you become a little woody. You start to understand wood better. Any material that you work with it for many years, could be paint, could be, concrete. It has an effect on you. So that kind of knowledge implies that humans are part of nature and nature is part of humans. And so if you try to ignore the Cartesian separation between us and nature, you start to understand that everything is affecting you, especially, for instance, right now in April in Connecticut, because everything is sprouting. The grass is probably already a little bit green, and the bushes already have small sprouts, and very soon the trees will have new leaves, and this affects you a lot. We need to elaborate on those effects. We need to elaborate and value that relationship between us and nature, us and us and other people too. Remember that for the traditional Amerindians, the indigenous Amerindians, there is no death penalty. They have no prisons. The worst penalty possible when you commit a hideous crime is isolation. You are expelled from the group and you have to live on your own. That means you lose your humanity. So for the indigenous Americas, you are only human if you interact with other humans. If you are alone by yourself, you are not a human anymore. Those things, I am certain that there is important knowledge lessons there for us to make better architecture.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you so much for bringing in also the Amerindian perspective, which is a great addition to the class too. And I'll give it now back to Jane for the question from section D now.
Sure. Jenny, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Of course. Thanks so much for tuning in. My question is basically focused about what the difference is between the level of concepts or the level of material conditions when you describe coloniality and modernity. And I think it might be a helpful clarification to have, because in your piece, I was confused as to whether there was mostly a semiotic link between modernity and coloniality, or like in how we conceive of the concept, or if it was actually the material conditions that like help them become entangled. So I was wondering what you think.
Thank you. That's a great question. That's a great question. Thanks for pointing out the semiotic relationship there, because that's an important part of my background that is buried somewhere from 25 years ago. But I actually think it's material. I actually think the relationship is material. The modernity started when some people thought that they could manipulate others, other peoples, other genders, other materials, the whole earth, the whole of nature, any way they want. So when you have the Cartesian separation between mind and body, it means that the body is there to be exploited. And the body means all of nature, all of women, all of non-white men. They're there to be exploited. So the relationship is very material. The relationship is very material. It's like bodies that can be disposable, that can be used for profit, and you can think about that as the female body or the non-white body, and those bodies includes all the trees and all the natural resources and all the rivers, and there is a beautiful movement going on nowadays around the world, giving rights to nature, right? So a river can sue a government for failing to protect its waters, or a species of fish can sue a company that have polluted the water. So it's in that direction that I think we need to go. And I think the relationship, of course, it's very symbolic, also very semiotic, but in the end, it's very material. There's a beautiful text from a few years ago. You can Google it. It's called "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." It's a wake-up call to the fact that when we talk about decolonization, it shouldn't remain on the intellectual level. It needs to have real implications on the way we structure society, the way we do reparations, the way we engage with feminism, the way we engage with all the battles of the 21st century. To me, it's very material.
Thank you, Jenny, for your question. And now I'll ask Iris if you can call on a question from section E.
Yes, Anna, would you like to ask your question and also post it in the group chat, please?
Yeah. Okay, so I was thinking about the way you discuss abstraction as erasure or flattening of space and history in order to be able to manipulate the essence of a context into an architectural thesis. But do you think that this has also precipitated an accelerated speed in the design process? And if the depth and multiplicities of contexts were actually negotiated, would that require a slowing down of our practices, especially if multiple voices were to be involved, as you were discussing in the Decolonizing the Spatial History of the Americas
That's
proposals?
a really good question. That's a great question. I do think that our spatial tools, our tools for manipulating space are a kind of accelerator. I do think that. I do think that they accelerate the optimization, they optimize and accelerate the interventions. Do we need to slow down as a response? Probably yes. I think participatory processes are a way, another vaccine against the epidemic of abstraction. And when you talk about participatory processes in real projects, the first complaint of the contractors is that it slows down the process. There's no time for do it because we need to inaugurate this piece of infrastructure before the election, in the case of public architecture, or fast enough to turn a profit in the case of private architecture. So that's a really good question. I actually think I need to think more about the speed into that equation, because I think I agree with you. Abstraction is an accelerator, and we probably need to hit the brakes and slow down. I mean, and we have to remember, we have a major reckoning ahead of us that your generation will have to face. And the reckoning is the most sustainable thing to do is not to build. I mean, we all know that. But how will architecture react to that paradigm? So it poses all kinds of questions to the discipline of architecture, and it also poses questions for the fact that it's only a minority that fully experience the benefits of modernization. And we have a majority of the planet that is on the colonized side of the equation. So how do we reconcile the sustainable challenge of building less with the fact that we have a very unequal built environment? Those things to me are the big questions that your generation will face. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And I'm just, it made me think also of processes of design and construction that introduce, whether they're incremental processes or open-ended projects, as something that also tries to challenge. These introduces a different notion of temporality in projects, and which have been a big staple of Latin American architectures and constructions for decades now. But so we'll move on. Iris, should we go now back to section C?
Yes, Erin has a question about sort of a parallel reading between you and Quijano, I think. it would be very interesting to hear her question. Erin, if you can unmute yourself and also post your question at the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the talk and conversation so far. So my question, yeah, again, compares the two readings. And so social totality, as described by Hannibal Quijano, evokes a sort of social abstraction similar to the way you discuss the abstraction of site and landscape. As colonialism perpetuated social homogeneity, modernism introduced abstraction, which continues to permeate architectural pedagogy and practice, and globalism has only perpetuated this spatial homogeneity. As some academic institutions have tried to diversify or decolonialize their curriculums, this usually manifests in the form of additional non-European readings and rarely extends to studio pedagogy. Both in my first undergraduate studio and my first graduate studio here, we were stripped of the site and were taught to design architecture autonomously and either post-rationalize or ignore the site altogether. This reasoning for this is often to eliminate unnecessary complexity for young designers that maybe can't handle that complexity. However, I think it establishes a paradigm in which architecture is both autonomous and superior to the site. And so I wanted to ask you, why do you think the efforts to decolonialize our pedagogies have not extended to studio as much as it has history and theory courses?
That's a great question. Thank you. I face that in my own school at the University of Texas every other week. I think we are making progress in many components of architectural education. I have to give credit for the planners because they started talking about participatory processes and other knowledges before. And then history theory is now catching up. And we are discussing more and more of those things. And then studio is really behind. I totally agree with you. I see some progress in the way that some people are testing new pedagogies and testing new ideas, but it's far from being mainstream and it's far from having a real impact. But I don't think it can be stopped. I don't think it can be reversed. I think the tsunami of relational knowledges and decoloniality is coming for studio. I went to school at the time that the digital tsunami came through the schools. So when I was in school 30 years ago, my professors were saying that, no, you don't need computers. You should do everything by hand because computers they dumb down architecture. They water down your ideas. They don't really help the process. And then look at us today, and there's nothing outside of the computer. Of course, you need to build some models and you need to sketch, but the process has been completely absorbed by the digital realm. I think social inequality and climate change will force a change in the design studios. The relationship between our social crisis and our climate crisis is directly linked to that pedagogy that tells you to ignore the site and ignore the user and abstract spaces because they are, I don't know, more fruitful or more profitable. That process, what I'm trying to write about in my scholarship is that process started in 1492 and it still prevails. We're still going through it. But right now we have a consciousness of that process and we have a consciousness of the dark side of that spatial abstraction. And we need spatial abstraction. We can't transform the planet without it. We are not going back to indigenous ways of buildings, but we need to tension spatial abstraction. We need to problematize spatial abstraction with other knowledges to make it better. The goal is to make it better, not to discard it. But you are absolutely right on your diagnosis of the problem.
That's great. Thank you, Aaron, so much for the question about studio. And on the note of abstraction, I'm going to ask now Fuad to ask your second question. It will relate to abstraction and to some reservations about a Western hegemony on the notion of abstraction. So I'll give it to Fuad so he can ask the second question, Fuad. Fuad, we can't hear you. Something about your sound, your volume.
Just gonna use Aaron's.
All right.
But okay, I can't see the question. Well, okay, so my question is that if just give me 1 second.
A little technical glitch. It's a classic.
Don't you think that Western influence is given too much credit for a human mindset and set of mind, which is the set of mind which is abstract, of the abstract thinking, as if in the stripping of imagery to kind of have a clean slate where you could recreate and rejudge upon what's outdated in a previous idea. Because to me, the abstraction which the West has relied on, it seemed to me is more like a tool rather than they just kind of seems like they misuse the tool. Because in other cultures, in a way, it seems like everybody did the abstraction in a way to rethink what their world is offering and what's not working. Wait, let's see. So do you feel like to associate abstraction to the West is kind of a slippery slope where it might give ideas that abstraction is demonized? Isn't it kind of a tricky?
No, I agree with you. It's very tricky. The way I am trying to understand that, and I wrestle with exactly that question, because abstraction is at the root of human thinking. So the process of thinking, and I'm going back to Piaget and others here that wrote about it in the early 20th century. The process of thinking is a process of abstraction. So the way that I try to be more precise about it is talking about spatial abstraction as different from abstraction. So abstraction is at the root of our thinking, is at the root of all the languages, is at the root of all the writing systems. So abstraction is universal to Homo sapiens. Now, spatial abstraction is exactly what you described. It's a series of tools that were developed to manipulate and control space. So I think I have to be very precise when I'm talking about spatial abstraction versus abstraction in general, because yes, abstraction is universal to Homo sapiens. There is now even some research saying that some birds and other animals like octopus, they are also capable of abstraction. So I'm very curious, and I follow what people are writing about that, because I think it helps me think. But when I'm talking about the process of representation, I'm talking about spatial abstraction, processes of representation for control and manipulate spaces. And then those, I think, so far, they are intimately connected to Europe after the 16th century, borrowed a lot from Arabic knowledge, from North Africa and from the Middle East, from the centuries prior. There's a lot of things that were borrowed. The name of the rose, the whole encounter between Plato and Aristotle knowledge that happened after the fall of Constantinople, and there's a lot there that I would love to explore. There's a lot of Arabic knowledge that is at the basis of that. But what I'm calling the process of spatial abstraction are drawing techniques to control space. And those were experimented, I think, around the 15th century, but really systematized experimented in the 15th century, systematized in the 16th century. And that's where I position the occupation of the Americas as a significant component of that process. But North Africa is an intimate part of that process too, even more than the Americas, because the relationship is older.
Thank you. Thanks, Fernando.
Thank you.
That's a great clarification, and I think this is really helpful. And we'll give one more question from the students, because I was still trying to save a few minutes at the end to give it also voice to my wonderful TFs, because I know that they would like to ask questions too. So we'll have one more question from section D. Jane?
Yes, great. I'm really glad that Fernando mentioned the rights of nature. I think Ben has a question exactly about nature. So yeah, please unmute and.
Hi, hello, and thank you, Fernando. So my question is a mildly different take about the different relational paradigms with regards to nature and then the built environment. And in your clarification of like epistemic colonization and disobedience, you noted that for nature-centric designers, right, the idea of authenticity and craftsmanship is reviewed by this need for extreme precision in detailing, whereas indigenous architecture seems to express the same authenticity and craftsmanship as like varied levels of roughness and immediacy, and not so much an obsession with the construction precision. So my question then is it possible that this conceptual framework of the relationship, this particular relationship, it's kind of like emanating from a deeper dichotomy of outlook with regards to like how both these sets of like crucial designers are perceiving nature? Could the obsessive precision of the nature-centric architecture be a result of a deeper antagonism and fear of the natural world itself? And then the precision and the scientifically inclined design becomes a way to tame nature. Whereas it seems to me indigenous architecture seems to have like a more agreeable relationship with nature and would not need to burden itself with exactitude in building, since nature is like a friendly co-creator in the whole process. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a beautiful question. I will answer that, calling your attention to two very different cosmogonies, so myths of how the world was created. So the Christian myth of how the world was created, there was a man and a woman in nature, in paradise, and the woman did something wrong, and they were expelled from nature, right? That's Adam and Eve and our Christian myth of creation. The myth of creation of North America, indigenous peoples, is that a woman, always a woman, she fell from the sky holding the seeds of 3 plants, and she was saved by a turtle. That's why the turtle is an important component of the myth of creation in North America, and they called the land Turtle Island. It's because in the myth of the creation of the world, this woman fell from the sky into a lake, into a water, and she was going to drown, but she was saved by a turtle. And she was able to put soil on the shield of the turtle, and she planted the 3 seeds there. And they are corn, squash, and beans, the 3 sisters that are the basic plants of North American civilizations. So just by comparing those 2 myths of creation, you have one in which the original man and woman were expelled from nature, and you have another one in which a woman was saved by an animal and then was able to improve on nature by planting the seeds of the 3 major crops of North America. And it's right there. I mean, from those myths of creation, you can elaborate on that relationship, that it's either separation or embracing nature. Now, I have to acknowledge that I focus my time and my reading efforts and my attention to the Americas. I'm sure there are other amazing myths of creation in other parts of the planet that I don't know about, that also would help us understand the different relationship with nature. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Fernando, would you have a few more minutes
Sure,
to answer a couple more questions?
Great,
because
thank you.
I would like to give also the opportunity to my two fantastic teaching fellows who are leading the sections, and they're PhD students here in the school. And so I would ask Jane or Iris if you have a question that you'd like to then to pose to Fernando.
Yeah, hi, Fernando. Thank you very much again for the talk. I think my question is more about how to write, how to decolonialize architectural history. So like how do we do our research? And I think for me, I find your framework of connecting coloniality to modernity very strong. And I think it's pointing, I'm from China, and that is a place that is not entirely colonialized, but still I find common frameworks and problems that would work for my research and help me to understand my relationship with the history of my country. But I wonder, but China is also somewhere that situates sort of uncomfortably in the post-colonial framework because it's not completely colonialist. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the limit of the post-colonial, the concept and the framework of the post-colonial or post-colonial history, and how do we sort of think about it in a broader context, probably outside of the Americas.
Thank you. So I have been struggling with that for 25, 26 years now. And actually starts when I arrived in the US, because I grew up in Brazil, white, male, cisgender in Brazil, and I was at the top of the food chain, right, in that society. And I also learned the history of Brazil as a continuation of European history. Like the Brazil, the way I learned about Brazil is that Brazil was created by the Portuguese who came in the 16th century. And yes, we have native inhabitants, we also had slavery, but the Brazilian history is a continuation of Portuguese history. When I got to the US, and I thought, I was taught that Brazilian history was also part of Western history. The Brazilians teach their history as being a continuation of the West. When I got to the US, I was surprised to discover that Latin America is not part of the West. You know, how come? It's the history until the early 20th century is exactly the same. You have native inhabitants, you have some civilizations that were sophisticated and were stratified and highly productive, others that were more nomadic and more had less surplus. And then you have the European invasion, and then the native inhabitants are killed by disease as much as by gunpowder. And then you have slavery, and then you have the settler colonialism. I mean, the history of the US and Brazil are very, very similar. But somehow in the 20th century, when the US became a global power, it created the idea of the West, that is parts of Europe, the United States, Canada, and Australia, which is on the other side of the planet. It has a lot to do with the Anglo colonies and the integration of the British colonies into the new economy. That was a spark to me to try to engage differently with that history. And when you flip the perspective and you look at, in my case, when I flip the perspective between the US being the West or Brazil is not, or the US is developed and Brazil is not, there's a lot of underdevelopment here. There's a lot of inequality, a lot of poverty, a lot of violence. When you remove those stereotypes, you start seeing that the history, yes, it's very, very, very similar. Now, in the case of China, I would love to learn more. I am dying to learn more because everything I've learned about Chinese architecture and Chinese spaces was written by Western writers. I'm dying to learn more about the Chinese perspective on that. And I think being the Middle Kingdom, right? I mean, the center of the world, that's how you should write that history. You should write that history from the perspective of China, from the history of China. And I would love to read that in the near future. A spatial history that includes architecture and public spaces, etc., that is written from the Chinese perspective, because I haven't had a chance to read it yet. And I'm completely convinced that the Western framework is absolutely insufficient to tell that history. We cannot tell that history properly if we insist on the chronology of, the Portuguese were the first to arrive there in the 1490s, and then the Spanish followed, and they started trading in the Philippines. No, this is completely insufficient. I want to read the history of those spaces from the perspective of 4,000 years of Chinese history. And yeah, that's my hope.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane and Fernando. Iris, would you like to?
Yes, I'll try to keep it very short, and it moves along similar lines as Jane's, my question about the writing of architectural history and theory. And I'm just wondering, you talk about the need for new concepts, but I'm also wondering if kind of the relational knowledge that you describe can be put in use to challenge the kind of normative and colonial modes of rationality and the cause-effect relationships that we usually tend to kind of analyze events. And so I'm wondering if we should also completely shift our methodological ways of writing architectural history and the very categories that we are using.
I think so, yes. But I think it's a generational challenge that will go way beyond my lifetime. Yes, we need the new, there's already a significant improvement. If you read the architectural history of the 20th century, it was written for these male heroes that are genius architects that we have finally abandoned that, and we are writing a much more social history of architecture. In the 21st century, our survey books are changing. The books that we celebrate and that we give awards are changing. I think, for instance, of the book by Fabiola Lopes Duran, who showed the eugenics written on the Corbusier notebooks. Hundreds of scholars browse those notebooks since the 1960s, since Corbusier died and the notebooks became available for research. And not a single one of those hundreds choose to talk about the eugenics ideas that were written there until Fabiola Lopes Duran did it. So I also wonder what kinds of terrible things are in me right now. Like if people who look at my texts in the next 50 years look back and like, how come he could write this? What an awful thought. So I have to ask that myself too. I mean, what kind of biases are informing what I write? But I think it's a generational process. I think it's already started, already changing, but it will take decades.
It's amazing, right? Just the fact that we're no longer just concentrated on writing monographs. I think it's an amazing shift, because we were there about like 15 years ago still. But it is true, and second guessing, I think it comes with the job. It's really with every step we take. But this has been quite an amazing trajectory, an amazing itinerary that you took us through, Fernando, even ending on Ira's question and James on how to decolonize architectural historiography, not just architecture and architectural history, but even historiography, and the way that we write about it. And I cannot thank you enough. I feel like we could keep going. There were a lot more questions that will now continue in the section.
Yes.
And
no, we'll have other opportunities to continue that conversation. We're just starting.
Oh yes, you're on a roll, and I'll be following and seeing everything that we do, and hopefully we'll have a chance to catch up again soon, and soon also to have you then on campus.
Are you going to SAH this year?
I will not be there this year, but I know that you are, and I know that you have an incredible panel. So you have Reinhold in your group too, right?
Yes,
Which is well, I enjoy it. I'll be.
Thank you.
And
thank you for the invitation, Marta. It's been a pleasure, and thank you all for the amazing questions that you asked. I hope you keep asking those questions. So just if you keep asking those questions, you're going to be on a good path.
It's what we've been trying to do the whole semester, is asking questions. Fernando, thanks again for a wonderful presentation and a fantastic conversation too. And
thank you, Marta.
Talk soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye,
Thank you so
Fernando.
much.
Thank you.
Bye.